Good morning, CFC. To this, what it would be, middle of March, Sunday, 14th. I hope that you're having a great day. I'm wanting to, by the way, my sweater matching the wall was accidental. I wish I'd have thought that much ahead in terms of a color coordinated fashion sense. I've never thought of putting on a sweater or shirt so that it would match a wall. All the advantages of this COVID time where we get to talk to each other via Zoom and via a variety of other ways. Again, happy Sunday. I want to talk this morning about the problems of judgmentalism and how they're oftentimes tied to, even in a contemporary setting, the ascending of a Pharisaism. I'm going to start with an essay that I presented to some performing artists years ago, but it'll be a good launch pad for talking about some of the functional emphasis and the rationale behind Jesus's repeated emphasis on avoiding judgmentalism, and how this was picked up, of course, as a teaching focus by the Apostle Paul and Jesus' earthly brother, half-brother, St. James. But it's an essay called The Pharisaic Process, an Unholy Wedlock. Most Christians, even remotely familiar with the gospel, would recognize the Pharisees as the sect prominently noted for being recipients of Jesus' scathing denunciations. And I must add here that even though that the Pharisees were oftentimes orientational opponents of Jesus, and of course his teaching and his miracles and his proclamations were threats to the existing order, an order that was working, at least they self-perceived it as working in keeping Israel from reaching another cliff because of their covenantal disobedience. In Matthew 23, Jesus, our Savior, the meek and mild Jesus of Nazareth, labels these Pharisees as blind guides, whitewashed tombs who don't practice what they preach. He labels them as people who love the place of honor, which, by the way, is an occupational hazard for anyone in public ministry, anyone in public service. He calls them hypocrites, which is from the Greek word hypokrites, meaning mask wearer. And when it was originally used, it was simply that, somebody who wears a mask. Jesus was the one who essentially focused on the fact that there was a double-mindedness, there was a inconsistency morally. You were portraying someone who you really weren't. He calls them also sons of hell, who shut the kingdom of heaven in men's faces. You'd think that they must have been chainsaw murderers, right? How did the Pharisees get to this place? Here they were, about 3 centuries young, formed from a righteous desire to call all of Israel to covenantal obedience. They remembered, in fact, probably knew by heart a great percentage of the Pentateuch, and certainly all 613 Mosaic laws, right? They're trying to keep Israel from driving over the cliff of disobedience and resultingly being captured and punished again. And now Jesus calls these well-intended Pharisees enemies of the God that they think that they're serving. Imagine if somebody accused you of that. So what happened to the Pharisees? Let me propose in a nutshell that the Pharisees went the path of many institutions, even individuals who are highly successful, that experience prominence and power as a result of that vision and success. The institution is started for godly purposes. Soon it begins to meet its objectives and experiences the natural accolades. Eventually, an entrenched institutional clique is in full swing, and its significance preserved by the creation of tests that only club members, the insiders, could pass. Those that failed are labeled for a lifetime, be they tax collectors, be they sinners. Finally, plans are created to remove threats to their now established place of prestige. And of course, Jesus was the personification of that threatening removal from places of prominence, success, and prestige. So, you might be asking, what's that have to do with us? Sometimes, as I describe myself, a foot-shuffling follower of Christ. Well, the Pharisaical process can consume more than just powerful religious sects, denominational hierarchies, and divinity students. It can even cripple us as individuals, individual souls. For the individual, the process is prompted through the arena of self-described strength. And I want you at this point to start thinking about, if you were to describe yourself, and we're not going to have to do that in the discussion time, it's probably something very personal, but you know the areas of your life where you consider that you have strength, you have some prominence, some kind of self-described strength. Are you great in athletics? We have some athletes, certainly in our church. Wonderful. Athletics can serve the wisdom of Sabbaths marvelously. But the process can also create what I would call athletic Pharisees. And unless you're one of them, don't even think about getting a pass thrown your way in a pickup game of touch football. Do you consider yourself a superior parent? God knows we need you, but in the process toward wise parenting, we can get sucked into the cesspool of looking down on others who aren't quite as wise in their parenting, or maybe they haven't read as many James Dobson books as we have. More specifically, for the artistic practitioner, for the academic practitioner, for the professional practitioner in whatever your field, the problem can occur as an artistic, a professional, or an athletic Pharisaism. Each passing year, for instance, if I'm just talking about artists and performing artists, the artist accumulates knowledge and artistic refinement, in particular artistic expression, not unlike the rabbis in their training as children and as adolescents learn more and more each year. The artistic student, the academic student, learns the language and builds his or her own aesthetic Talmud. And remember, when we reference the Talmud, it's the oral interpretation of the written law. Remember the sermon the teaching I gave several months ago about explaining the Talmud and its interface with the Torah, which was the written law of God, Genesis through Deuteronomy especially. When my daughter, it turns out my daughter said it was her, not my nephew, but one time I basically said to her, you can't leave the table until you eat 3 spoonfuls of peas. And then she asked wisely, well then how many peas equals a spoonful? That would be a Talmudic interpretation of some written laws in the Patton household. By the way, I mentioned to Emily, my daughter, that it was 5 peas equals 1 spoonful. The journey of of Pharisaism, of judgmentalism, the journey can then take the self-satisfying. The journey academically, educationally, professionally, can then take them a self-satisfying distance from the uninitiated and ordinary person. And very subtly, the Pharisaic process does its ugly work. And a lot of what happens in this Pharisaic process associated with one's description of professional expertise, academic expertise, artistic expertise, knowledge expertise, What happens internally is characterized by what we'll describe later as a judgmentalism, judging others for not being as wise, as learned, as effective as oneself. Thankfully, the process can be avoided, the process of Pharisaism, when we remember that our journeys, whatever the journey artistically, academically, professionally, educationally, that our journey is never an end in and of itself. As Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, knowledge builds up. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. Growth in knowledge and experience is always to be seen in light of God's call of loving service to all people, not a basis through which to condescend to others. Furthermore, our journey should never be a source of condescension, but must always be a reconciling instrument in God's kingdom and at His disposal. That is the launch pad for talking about one of the characteristics of Pharisaism, is a judgmentalism, which is an enemy of the church, an enemy of individuals in the church. Looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 4, as Paul's having to deal with a church with several problems, many problems, not the least of which a divisiveness and an argumentativeness around who is the best or proper, most authoritative leader. Is it Paul? Is it Apollos? Is it Cephas? Peter? And there was divisiveness about individuals identifying with one of those apostles, if you will, and oftentimes it would be, again, a basis of condescension, of dismissiveness. Paul says anyone who's given a trust must prove himself faithful. And of course, in Paul's case, his trust was as an apostle. He was planting and helping churches to strengthen and grow. That was his responsibility, to which ultimately he would be answerable to God. He says, everyone given a trust must prove faith. Therefore, I care very little whether I'm judged by you or any human court. I don't even judge myself, but that doesn't make me innocent. I'm judged by God. Therefore, judge nothing before the appointed time. Wait for the Lord to appear. Then He will judge the motives of men's hearts. The Apostle Paul appears to be warning against the energy spent trying to diagnose a person's motivation. And in the Pharisees' case, as they were too oftentimes self-congratulatory and condescending, there were energy spent trying to diagnose why this sinner, why this tax collector was so degrading. And again, the point Jesus was making is your condescension keeps you from ministering to people where doctors are sent to help the healthy, and the self-described healthy and the self-righteous, but the sick. I didn't come to call the, in quotes, self-righteous, but sinners to repentance. Again, the Apostle appears in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, appears to be warning us against the energies spent trying to diagnose a person's motivations. A lot of the focus on judge not is avoiding the internal reasons why there might be external behavior. You can't see inside a person's heart. By the way, the heart is described as the source of the attitudes that go to make up a person, who they are and who they're wanting to be. I wanted to mention next is that in this process that lends itself to Pharisaism and judgmentalism, and we'll get to the 4 characteristics of judgmentalism in just a bit, but there's a built-in prejudice that has been a focus of several psychological and sociological and communication scholars. We call it the self-prejudice. We judge ourselves in our successes or failures, by our intentions. We always have good intentions, and yet we judge others by the seeming arithmetic of strict externals. Jesus says, stop it. Remember, and Paul got his perspective on avoiding making judgments, waiting for the Lord to appear. You don't know the motivation of men's hearts. They're too complex for you to be able to confidently assert. Jesus said in the last chapter of his Sermon on the Mount, judge not lest you be judged. Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 and forward. For the way that you judge others, you'll be judged. The instrument you use will be used against you. Okay, we're getting the impression, as we've looked at Paul's letter in 1 Corinthians chapter 4. First, judging others is about, and not judging others is about being overly cocky and confident and therefore condescending as to a person's motives. That's not for us to completely know now. Judge not lest you be judged. For the way that you judge others, you'll be judged. The instrument you use will be used against you. Then he goes on, and he says, why do you look at this speck of sawdust in your brother's eye, when all the while you have a 2x4 so large it could hold up a church roof protruding from your own? You hypocrite, first remove the plank, the 2x4 from your own eye, so that then you'll see clearly enough to help your brother with his speck. And then Jesus changes topics, if you will. But it helps us to understand what he means by judging. Because he then goes and says, don't throw your pearls to pigs, or else they'll trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to shreds. In this focus on the Sermon on the Mount, right after he says, judge not, he then says, don't cast your pearls to pigs. If Jesus was just talking about cognitive judgments between lightness and darkness, between thick and thin, then he would be condemning any cognitive analysis between pearls and pigs. We wouldn't know, or we would be sinning by diagnosing the difference cognitively between pearls and pigs. Think of this, press it even further. Even the ability given to Adam in the garden to name the animals, an ability traced to the common grace in human beings to make comparisons and contrasts, thus creating separate concepts and categories. This was a gift to be able to distinguish between pigs and pearls. It is part of the gift that we've been given. Jesus, when he condemns judging others, is not condemning cognitive judgments, distinctions that we have to make. And oh, by the way, the gift given to Adam and to us of making comparisons and contrasts based upon our experience, thus creating concepts and categories. Don't you think this is probably this wondrous precursor to the scientific method? So again, Jesus is not saying discard all cognitive distinctions, or else he would be condemning the distinctions between light and darkness, pearls and pigs, wisdom and folly. Moving on, Jesus, again in his emphasis on avoiding making judgments, strictly based upon externals, thinking that you know a person's motivations. Wait for the Lord to appear. In John chapter 7, verse 24, when he's responding to people who were amazed at his miracles, but have accused him of being possessed by evil spirits. And he said, stop judging by mere appearances. We can't even sometimes figure out confidently why we ourselves do the things we do. This is hinted at in Proverbs chapter 20, verse 5, 18 centuries prior to Sigmund Freud describing the unconscious. But Proverbs chapter 20 verse 5 says the purposes of a person's heart are deep waters. The whys of their behavior are sometimes deep waters. But a person of understanding tries to draw them out in an introspective, intrapersonal way. In other words, the whys of even our own patterns of behavior and habits are not completely known to us. They can even be mysteries. We can be even a mystery to ourselves. We can't think even we have ourselves all figured out, let alone someone else, and being able to boldly and arrogantly point out their motivations for victories or defeats or problems or solutions. The Apostle Paul, in his letter to the Romans, 7 years before many of them would be persecuted by Nero's persecutions, he says, in talking to people who have experienced deep divisions, a different cause of the divisions than in Corinth. And this time it was divisions between people who had differing opinions about whether or not they should eat meat offered to idols, or whether or not they should hold certain days more holier than others. Paul says, let each man be confident in his own position, but stop making judgments about others. Stop condescending to them. Stop the pattern of judgmentalism. He says in chapter 14, verse 13, stop passing judgment. And again, he's not making a statement about cognitive distinctions between light and darkness, between exits and entrances, between pigs and pearls. He's saying, don't make the confident assertion that you know the motivations for a person who disagrees with you behaviorally, doctrinally, and then gives you then you give yourself justification for condescending. Stop passing judgment. Then the Apostle James, Jesus' half-brother, if you will, says in the 4th chapter, verses 11 and 12 of James chapter 4, brothers, do not slander each other. Brothers and sisters, don't slander each other. Anyone who speaks against his brother and judges him speaks against the law and judges it. And when you're judging the law, you're not keeping it, but you're sitting in judgment on it. There is one lawmaker and judge, the one who is able to save and destroy. But you, who are you to be judging your neighbor? And again, this warning by Jesus and his apostles to stop making condescending judgments about a person's internal motivations. This is especially a focus of the New Testament. In closing, I wanted to just provide 4 categories of judgmentalism, this disease that gives us self-justification for condescending, for separating ourselves as superior. What are the 4 dominant categories of judgmentalism? And you might think of some others. First, I would say judgmentalism is inherently condescending. It's why we're repeatedly warned not to be judgmental, because Jesus wants us to avoid being condescending to others, even our ideological opponents, our theological opponents, people made in the image of God. We're called to call them to God, not by condescending arrogantly. Again, judgmentalism is inherently condescending. It's also, secondly, inherently self-exalting. That's the result of the condescension, but self-exalting, which provides the self-justifications, the excuses for the negative effects of judgmentalism. For instance, oftentimes the rich, and you can see this in Amos, you can see this in James, their condescension and dismissives of the poor. They think they know the motivations and all of the causes as to why somebody is desperately in need. Oh, they just didn't work as hard as me. If they would have just responded to opportunities like I did and had the effort that I had, This is a common self-congratulatory self-justification for condescension, and it's the self-exalting of ourselves in areas of success. Thirdly, after judgmentalism is inherently condescending and inherently self-exalting, it's inherently the enemy of empathy. And if we are going to be ministering to others, motivated by love, there's going to be an empathetic regard, being able to walk in another person's shoes, and also being able to transcend the tendency to think we've got them all figured out as to why they have their problems. Inherently, judgmentalism is the enemy of empathy. As Abraham Joshua Heschel has said, that empathy is a key in cultivating godliness. And then fourth, judgmentalism inherently prevents the cultivation of one's own spiritual journey toward Christ-likeness. In judgmentalism, in expending energy, tagging, labeling a person's motivations when we don't know yet. We do not even have the eyes of Christ. We cannot know. So, CFC, avoiding the spiritual trap of self-congratulations, even as we experience spiritual victories and disciplines and success. Our judgmentalism triggers will be rooted in our areas of self-described success, self-described growth, self-described victories, self-described professional advancement, academic advancement, athletic advancement, intellectual advancement, ministerial advancement. Judge not, lest you be judged. Let's avoid judgmentalism, especially in this period of extreme division in the church and in the culture. Blessings on you. Amen. Be encouraged.